Hello, everyone. It's 4 minutes past the hour, so let's begin our webinar. We are very pleased, of course, to welcome you to this data collection webinar series, which is organized by the Data Collection Unit in UNICEF headquarters. I'm Attila Handjoğlu. I am the Chief of the Data Collection Unit in UNICEF headquarters in New York. For those of you who are joining this webinar series for the first time, this webinar series covers topics that have recently gained importance and where there is ongoing work on how best to collect data. And today our webinar is entitled Leaving No One Behind in Official Statistics, Inclusion of Forcibly Displaced in National Surveys and the SDG Indicators. Before I hand over to our speaker, some housekeeping rules. We have scheduled about an hour and 30 minutes today, including Q&A. As always, throughout the webinar, please remain muted. Kindly write your questions in the chat box, and we will try to group your questions and direct them to the presenter during the Q&A. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our UNICEF SharePoint site together with the past webinars. And we will also post the recording to the Mix YouTube channel and will become publicly available. You can find the links to both of these in the email that you received from us. As I mentioned earlier, today's webinar is entitled Leaving No One Behind in Official Statistics, Inclusion of Forcibly Displaced in National Surveys and the SDG Indicators. And we are very happy to have with us Felix Schmieding, who is a senior statistician at the World Bank UNHCR Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement. I would like to now hand over to Felix to start the presentation. Felix, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Attila, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues, wherever you are. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here in this webinar series. And it's great that I get the opportunity to talk about this important topic. I see some friends, some good and current and some very old friends in the audience. So those of you, you know who you are. It's great to see you. So as Attila already said, my presentation today is really about forcibly displaced, i.e. refugees and IDPs, internally displaced people, and how they are getting increasingly included into national surveys and into the SDG indicator debate. Now, some of you will be very familiar with the topic of forced displacement and with refugees and IDPs. So apologies, I'll start with a bit of the big picture and the context for those who are maybe a bit less familiar, but I'll move very swiftly into the topic of data collection. So my presentation has two parts. The first one is the big picture, and it's really about the question, why are we even talking about inclusion in national surveys? And the second part is more technical, where I talk a little bit about the challenges and some of the common misperceptions around including refugees and IDPs in national surveys. So just very briefly on the context, as many of you are aware, forced displacement has really been on the rise over the past years. We now have more than 100 million refugees and IDPs globally, which is more than double the number 10 years ago. So really a drastic increase over a very short period of time. And of course, the vast majority of these are living in low and middle income countries. So the increasing numbers on the one hand, but also the share of the protractedness of displacement is also on the rise, which means that people are that outdated notion of refugees fleeing from a crisis, moving over the border, receiving asylum and protection for a few months and then going back home. That there's more and more places where that is not the case, and where that is not happening, and people are staying as refugees in a country of asylum for many years and sometimes even generations. which means that we need to shift our thinking about forced displacement from it being purely a humanitarian concern to it also being a development challenge. And that's why this whole, that's sort of the very foundation and the very context in which this whole discussion about inclusion of refugees and IDPs in national surveys is taking place. Now, given this background and given this context of greater protractedness and the whole humanitarian development nexus on for displacement, there's more and more calls and more really a mindset shift and mindset change that that calls for greater inclusion of refugees and IDPs in government's development plans, in government's development programming. So we find this, of course, first and foremost in the Leave No One Behind principle of the Agenda 2030. But there's also very explicit references in the Global Compact on Refugees, in the UN Action Agenda on Internal Displacement, and most recently in the World Development Report, which is dedicated to the topic. But while we see more and more countries and more governments, really opening up to that or opening their national systems to forcibly displaced people, we don't yet see that same shift, that sort of tide shift when it comes to the data landscape, because we still see that surveys are often, survey work on refugees and IDPs is often left to the humanitarian agencies, and oftentimes they're excluded or not appropriately identified or represented in major national surveys such as the DHS, the MIX, the Labor Force Survey, or the National Poverty and Living Conditions Surveys, which come under many different names. But this is a problem because, of course, if we're expecting governments to open their national education systems, their national health systems, their social protection systems, all these national systems to forcibly displaced people and make them inclusive, then that can only happen on the basis of data that governments own and trust. And that is, to a very large degree, the national surveys that I just mentioned. So there's really a discrepancy between how much is already happening on inclusion in national systems more widely and what could be termed statistical inclusion. But things are happening, and there's been really, I would say, over the last 3 years or so, 3-4 years, there's really been a lot of movement. And it's been sort of going in parallel on 2 tracks. The first track is when it comes to international statistical standard setting. Now, as we all know, national statistical offices, they build their data production on international statistical standards. And those standards are set first and foremost by the UN Statistical Commission, which is the highest body of the global statistical system, and which brings together the chief statisticians from all UN member states, and where they agree and endorse these statistical standards, which national statistical offices build all their data production on. And this commission in 2016 acknowledged this new normal, if you like, where governments and national statistical offices take greater ownership of statistics on refugees and IDPs. So they acknowledged this, and they created in 2016 a group on refugee statistics, on an expert group on standardizing refugee statistics. And the mandate of this group has gradually improved. Now it's no longer just an expert group on refugee statistics. It sort of got bits and pieces added, and its acronym developed over time. So now it's called EGRIS with 2 S at the end. So it's now the expert group on refugees, IDPs, and statelessness statistics. And as you can see in this little map there, it now has 55 governments being members, as well as 35 regional and international organizations. So that is really, I think, an acknowledgement that data collection on refugees and IDPs is not something that can be left solely to the humanitarian agencies, but rather something that is also an important field of engagement for national statistical offices, because that's what the UN Stats Commission is for, right? The UN Stats Commission endorses standards that are binding on national statistical systems, and you wouldn't create such an expert group if there wasn't a need for national statistical systems to engage in this field of statistics. And this group has been very productive, and there's been 3 sets of international statistical recommendations developed and brought back to the Stats Commission, which was first the international recommendations on refugee statistics, then the ones on IDP statistics 2 years later, and most recently in 2023, the international recommendations on statelessness statistics, which all 3 were endorsed by the United Nations Statistical Commission. And there's a link at the very end of the presentation where you can look at those, where you can sort of find those recommendations. So that's the first really strand of recent exciting developments, and the second one is not so much at the global level, but very much at the country level, which is that we've seen more and more national statistical offices include refugees and IDPs in their national surveys. And when I say include, I obviously mean dedicated samples, appropriate identification, which are the 2 cornerstones of inclusion in national surveys. So just to give a few examples, as you can see here, there's a few NICs, a few DHS, there's a few national COVID surveys, and most I would say by way of numbers, the survey series that has seen the greatest degree of inclusion so far is national poverty and living conditions surveys, where we've really seen a lot of successes in the recent years, and also quite a strong pipeline going forward into 2023, 2024 as well. So lots on the horizon, and there's a couple of opportunities that are on the horizon that I didn't yet put in the slide. But there's going forward, there's some really exciting opportunities also being discussed right now. So as you can see, when you look at those numbers, this is really a very recent development, right? So this idea that we bring refugees and we bring IDPs as a sampling stratum, representative sampling stratum into our national surveys, it really started in 2018, I would say. And since, it's been picking up speed, and it's a very exciting development. And of course, this data that we are getting out of these surveys is extremely rich. We know that these national survey programs that these global survey programs are extremely rich and well designed. So the data we're getting out of it is really incredible and is really unprecedented for forcibly displaced populations. And it's giving this really rich information that informs and improves responses to forced displacement by government and its partners. And of course, beyond informing responses and policies and programs directly, it also makes sure that we don't have a blind eye, a blind spot on refugees and IDPs when it comes to our big goals, our big global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. Because when we have this data, we can disaggregate our SDG indicators by forced displacement status, and we can monitor and we can report on how the refugees and the IDPs are doing, and we can do that through this important channel that is the Sustainable Development Goal indicators. So I'll pause briefly at this end of the first part of my presentation to show you a quick video, and then I'm going to come back and continue with the second part of my presentation, which is as I said, the technical part. So I'm handing over to Arcana, who is going to screen that video, and then I'm going to reshare my screen.
How do governments allocate health and education services, social protection, and livelihood support? Data from major national surveys like MIX, DHS, labor force surveys on poverty, and living conditions surveys play a crucial role in identifying who needs what. These surveys represent almost everyone who lives in a country, but they often exclude refugees and internally displaced people. This is a blind spot in national data and a real obstacle for governments in finding solutions to forced displacement, which the Global Compact on Refugees, the UN Action Agenda on Internal Displacement, and the Agenda 2030's Leave No One Behind principle are all calling for. Why are refugees and IDPs excluded from national surveys? When forcibly displaced people live in camps, these locations are often crossed off the map when the survey sample is selected. When they live among the wider population, they are only occasionally picked up by the random sample selection process. But because they constitute only a small part of the population, they end up being a tiny fraction of the survey sample. This is not enough to produce any reliable analysis. The solution is to include refugees and IDPs fully in national surveys. Changing the tide. A growing number of countries are beginning to include refugees and IDPs in essential surveys. Together with national statistical offices and international partners, we are fixing the blind spot, ensuring that refugees and IDPs are no longer invisible in national surveys. We are the World Bank, UNHCR, Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement. Look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Arcana. Arcana, can you confirm that my slides are back on?
Yes, they are.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Indeed. So that little video just doubled down on everything I said before. So repetition helps digest, I suppose, is the idea here. Moving on to the second part of my presentation and taking more of a technical view at things. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I just have 2 slides here so that we have time for discussion. First of all, I often sort of go into the sort of the technical side of these conversations, trying to sort of work against perhaps the most frequent misperception that I come across when I talk about inclusion in national surveys of refugees and IDPs, and that's this idea that if you want to include refugees and IDPs in your mix, in your DHS, in your national poverty survey, you need to add on a lengthy questionnaire module on displacement. And we know that these big surveys, they have very, very long and very detailed questionnaires already. So they're stretching what's doable in terms of interview length. And that is not at all the case. More often than not, all we're asking is just to add a few small identification questions so that we can make sure we know that we're talking to a refugee or an IDP. But other than that, we're not talking about extensive additional modules. And the logic here simply is that while refugees and IDPs might have specific and heightened vulnerabilities compared to the wider population, you would usually see that in the levels or the performance of the indicators that we already capture for the rest of the population. So we don't have to come up with new indicators and reinvent the wheel on the indicators and the questionnaire side. We can just measure what we're already measuring and what we've spent many years perfecting in measuring. So we want to measure the same indicators. We just want to see how the performance and the levels is of refugees and IDPs in those indicators. So that's not the main challenge at all. But what are the actual technical challenges? So there's obviously a list of things that need to be overcome, but I think the most common 3 are sampling, identification, and languages. Sampling obviously being perhaps the most challenging one and the most demanding one, because we know that, and this was briefly mentioned in the video, we know that in most countries, refugees and IDPs constitute a very small part of the population, but we also know that sample size calculation is not driven first and foremost by population size. So if you have a population that would be maybe 1% of the overall population, and you would end up, if you just use your regular sampling protocol for the survey, you would end up with 1% of your sample survey being refugees, then that would usually not leave you with a large enough sample size to make any valid statistical inference. So we need to oversample, right? We need to draw a sample that is proportionally higher, that is higher, proportionally speaking, of our survey sample than forcibly displaced are in the wider population. Okay, how do we do that if we want to oversample? That means we need some kind of sampling frame, or we need to sensitize our existing sampling frame to finding those people that we want to oversample. And when we come to refugee and IDP sampling, where forcibly displaced live in camps or sites or settlements, it's actually fairly straightforward because it's a clearly defined geographical area. We can segment that area into something that resembles an enumeration area that is often used for survey work, or we can even draw a simple random selection of dwellings, which is often an even more efficient choice, given that we don't need to necessarily cluster our sample in an area that is so dense and highly concentrated like a refugee camp or an IDP site. So when it comes to site camps and settlements, it's fairly straightforward. We have been testing different approaches. Most recently, we've been working with building footprints from satellite imagery. That's also a really nice way of doing area-based frames in camps. When it comes to refugees and IDPs living outside of camps and settlements, the situation can be more challenging because, of course, you cannot easily sort of go to a certain area and know who is a refugee or an IDP household in that area. So this is something that can be challenging, but wherever we've tried, we've always found a suitable solution. One obvious one that people often resort to is to simply go to the registration lists, where there's a registration system in place for refugees. For example, we have a list of all the people that are registered refugees and often have a rough idea of their whereabouts. So that can be an easy solution in some places. In other places, we can sensitize existing sampling frames for surveys, try to identify the areas that have a high density of refugees and IDPs in them, and then either just oversample those areas if our simulation tells us that would result in a sufficiently large sample, or we even include a screening question in the listing where we can then sort of oversample from the places where we do a listing anyway. Sorry for those who are not samplers among you. I don't want to get too deep into sampling, but it is an important topic when it comes to refugees and IDPs, perhaps because that's the one part where the closest attention is required in a way. The second technical challenge that needs to be overcome is how do we identify refugees and IDPs in our survey? And I should start by saying that sometimes refugees and IDPs, when they're included in a survey, are not identified through the questionnaire at all because they come in through a dedicated sampling stratum or a dedicated sampling frame. So survey practitioners just assume that whoever they interview from that frame or in that stratum must be a refugee or an IDP. But it turns out that can be a flawed assumption. So it really makes sense to always have identification through the questionnaire, even when we assume that there's already pre-identification through the sampling approach. And how do we do identification? Well, it's fairly straightforward because EGRIS has developed and is offering a standardized question set. There is already a fully developed question set for census work, and there is an ongoing paper. Well, there is a paper being developed within EGRIS that also offers a standardized question set for household surveys. And depending on what you already have in your existing instruments, because oftentimes surveys already have a standard set of migration questions or related questions, the amount of additional questions you would add on differs a bit based on that. But usually you can say it's somewhere between 1 to 15 additional questions that are required for identification. And those questions that question set is going to be readily available. So it's not a massive technical challenge. And lastly, languages. It's it's an obvious one, but it does often come up in practice because national statistical offices obviously work with a pool of survey field staff that they work with regularly and that they that they can call on and bring in quite easily. But the languages spoken especially among refugees, is often a set of languages that is not readily available in that field staff pool. So it's something that just takes additional preparation. Sometimes it's possible to bring in to even complement refugees into the survey workforce if the legal situation in the country allows. So it's definitely something that can be overcome, but it's good to think about it well in advance in the survey design process. So that's pretty much my presentation. I've been asked to add a slide with suggestions for further reading. I'm not going to go through them, but I'm sure this will be shared. So here's a few suggestions for what else you might want to look at, especially from EGRIS, but also what JDC is doing on this in this area, and a couple of blogs and articles and a video from a recent event. So with that, I conclude my presentation. There's a little link to our website if you want to subscribe to our newsletter and keep in touch with the World Bank UNHCR Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement. And with that, back to you, Attila.
Thank you very much, Felix. This has been great. Thank you so much for the presentation. Let's go to some Q&A. I don't see many questions yet in the chat box, but there's one question already, which I think is your favorite question. Is there a possibility for JDC to cover the additional cost of sample size, due to the modification of the sample for the inclusion of displaced populations? Is the question coming from my colleague in UNICEF, Ranto?
Indeed. Thank you, Ranto. And I know we've been having conversations about this already. So that's an easy question for me because the answer is a clear and loud yes. So we in the JDC, we have been working with various statistical offices, helping them to include refugees and IDPs in national surveys. And we've been doing that, of course, with some technical assistance on the one hand, talking about identification, talking about sampling, talking about the things that I just mentioned. But on the other hand, we've been very much providing funding for that booster sample and for that extension. Now we're well familiar that we are a small part of that broader process because we're talking about a big national survey that is that is driven by the NSO and supported primarily by other agencies. But we can come in on that booster sample for the refugees and IDPs, and we can provide the necessary funding. We can provide some help with identification questions. We can provide help with linking up with existing sampling frames. Sometimes, if we're talking about a list frame that is held by UNHCR, we can help make those connections. And we can, if we're not talking about a list frame, we can share the experiences from other countries about sensitizing area frames to finding the forcibly displaced so that we can oversample them. So the answer is a clear yes, and we've been doing it in a number of countries, and we look forward to doing it in even more countries going forward.
Thank you very much, Felix. As you already know, I had mentioned it before we actually started the webinar that several of us are in, as the mixed team in Bangkok. And here in Bangkok, as part of one of the sessions, we talk about the topics for inclusion in mix which are in the pipeline. And displacement is one of those topics. So we covered it yesterday. I can tell you that there's a lot of interest from the mixed countries for inclusion of the module that will soon be available. And just to say that the mixed program has already committed to including this as a standard part of the surveys. We have been working on it. We have been working with you. Maybe I can ask a question that has been coming up, of course. Well, in the past, there has been many surveys actually which have included displaced populations. And in most of those cases, the strategy has been to redesign or do modifications to the sample design to be able to include such populations. But as we know, being an IDP or a refugee is an individual characteristic rather than a community characteristic necessarily. And as you pointed out, the assumption that everyone living in the same neighborhood, being an IDP and refugee, may be a flawed assumption. So in those cases, it becomes necessary to ask the questions in the questionnaires, and combine both sampling approaches as well as questionnaire approaches. Now, a question has been coming up. When you include these in the questionnaires to identify IDPs and refugees, if you're including them in the individual questionnaires, then you are going to be confined with the age groups which are covered in those individual questionnaires, as opposed to obtaining this individual characteristic for every household member. And some of the SDGs, as you know, are based on the population, not a specific age group or not households even, but on the population. And in relation to this, also, there's going to be mixed households, right? Some people are going to be identified as refugees or IDPs, some not. And some of these people are going to be children who have not been part of the IDP or refugee creating process, if you like. So there's conceptual issues in terms of how the analysis will be done in terms of these mixed households, in terms of children of refugees and IDPs, and how they're going to be incorporated into especially the population-based SDG indicators. I can give you an example, like some of the water and sanitation indicators, which really demand to be disaggregated by this status, are based on the total population rather than households. So how do we deal with that problem?
Thanks, Attila. That's actually something I could have put on the common technical challenges slide, because I do think it is something that comes up repeatedly, and it's a very good question. When it comes to the data collection, I think the answer is that we recommend to include it in the roster for all household members so that we know the displacement status. And given that it's usually not that many questions, and we can even sort of think about, do we sort of take a subset of 1 or 2 questions for the roster only, and then potentially follow up if we need with more detailed questions in the individual modules. But we should have an idea of displacement status for every member of the household, because as you say, displacement is an individual level characteristic. It's not a household level characteristic or a community characteristic. When it comes to the analysis stage, and we talk about analysis for individual level indicators, it follows logically that we can do that for every person based on having that characteristic at the individual level. But when it comes to household level indicators and household level analysis, then it becomes challenging. And at the moment, there's no sort of one answer to how one would disaggregate household level indicators by forced displacement status. I think there's a number of valid options, and it depends a little bit on how the different patterns you see affect the outcomes. So one obvious choice is to have disaggregation for households with at least one refugee or IDP in it. Another one would be to disaggregate by refugee or IDP headed households. So that sort of is, at least it's a clear conceptual category. But then it leaves a few specific cases of mixed households, sort of either in or out, that might drive or not drive the results. And what we've recommended in other countries is that when you have the data in and you look at the data, and you can do your analysis and look at, is there a big difference between just the households that have either a head or a spouse of head being a refugee or an IDP, or the same analysis for households with at least one member. And if it's not a big difference, then probably you don't need to worry about it. But if it is a big difference, then you want to sort of look into the different setups of families. And if you have households that have just are made up of mostly non-forcibly displaced people, and there's one person who may be married into the family who is a refugee, that person may not be driving the dynamics and the outcomes of that household. And then you can even further disaggregate, and because you have that information at the individual level, you can construct households headed by a refugee or an IDP, households with non-head of spouse members being refugees and IDPs, and you can see the dynamics of the indicators across those different setups. And then, depending on whether you pick up something in your country, in your given country, that is very unique in the pattern, you might even want to present your results by that. But of course, it depends on sample sizes whether you can do that. But the obvious choices are refugee headed and households with at least one refugee. That's sort of the two obvious ones, if you like.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Felix. There's at least 3 questions that I see in the chat box now. The first one is from Aman. It is a sampling related question. If we include pseudo EAs where IDPs live in a regular survey, this would be a convenience sampling, while the remaining EAs may come from the regular sampling frame. In that case, can we still include pseudo EAs for national level estimates? If yes, will that have any bias on the in the estimates for other indicators?
Yes, maybe I didn't. Maybe there was a misunderstanding in what I said when I meant, or what I meant when I said pseudo EAs. I did not mean a convenience sample. I did not mean a non-probabilistic sample. I meant a fully probabilistic setup where basically, if you're sampling outside of the camps and you're using a census-based frame made up of EAs, but you don't have EAs in the camp itself because the census, let's say the census excluded the camp, i.e. the NSO never segmented the camp into enumeration areas, you can just basically build your own enumeration areas, and you can take the blocks of the camp, or you can draw it whatever way, and that's what I meant by saying pseudo EAs. I did not mean a convenience sample. So you split that camp into what looks like an enumeration area, and you draw, just as you would outside the camp, you draw your first stage selection of those EAs, or those, as I would call them, pseudo EAs, and then you make a listing, you draw your second stage selection of households from that listing. So not at all convenience sample, very much a probabilistic sampling approach that would, that would link up very nicely with what you're doing outside of the camps.
All of this, of course, if these populations are not part of the already existing updated enumeration, the sample frame itself. So you're basically enhancing or enriching the existing, sample frame for the inclusion of these populations.
Very much so. And if I may, just because this is my favorite topic, when we work with national statistical offices, we see this sort of tendency to just do in the booster sample for the refugees or the IDPs, to just do what they're used to. And what they're used to is a 2-stage setup with enumeration areas at the first stage, and then a listing and then a household selection at the second. But that said, the only reason we do 2-stage sampling and clustered sampling is because if we didn't, our sample would become too dispersed to be cost effective, right? We need to somehow cluster our sample so that we can make it manageable to cover an EA in a day. But when you're talking about a camp, you're usually talking about a very condensed area. So there really is no need to cluster. You could just draw an unclustered sample of dwellings or households even if you wanted. And you gain efficiency, you gain sampling efficiency through that, right? Because clustering loses precision and clustering loses sampling efficiency. So if you had that flexibility to work with slightly different sampling approaches, my recommendation would be to not cluster in the camps. But in practice, because the NSOs just sort of want to use the same approach inside and outside the camps, they often just still go with the clustered approach in the camps. And that's also perfectly understandable and perfectly fine. But just to say, camps actually lend themselves to unclustered sampling.
Great. Thank you very much, Felix. The next question is from Bo. It's more about the politics of the whole process rather than the technical. He's saying that I assume that some NSOs argue against FDP sampling, for instance, by stating that this is not the national population, this is a temporary situation. Why would we include them in the national survey, etc.? Is there a good frequently asked questions document that you have on these types of questions, so that we are ready to answer those questions and have the justification to do so? And of course, also recognizing that nearly each FTP situation is unique, of course, but still, some FAQ would be great on this. Is Bo's comment and suggestion? Thanks,
Bo. I have an academic answer to that, a theoretical answer to that, and I have a practical answer to that. The theoretical answer to it is, it's absolutely true that there's no clear sort of international principle for national survey work that we can directly point to if we leave that sphere of EGRIS, right? Where EGRIS is obviously, everyone in EGRIS thinks that this makes sense. So the EGRIS work and the EGRIS product say you should do that. But beyond EGRIS, there's very little for national surveys when it comes to the population coverage. And if you compare it to censuses, the guiding principles and the international recommendations on censuses make it very clear. There's at least 5 references, very explicit references in the guiding principles for censuses, that a census counts everyone who is in the country on the day of the census. You could have it de jure or de facto, but in any case, IDPs and refugees should be counted in the census. It's very explicit, it's very clear in the international sort of recommendations on censuses. Now, for surveys, we don't have that, right? We don't have that very clear statement, that very explicit statement that refugees and IDPs should be included. So it's very much, if you're not a believer in what's been endorsed by the Stats Commission from EGRIS, then you have very much flexibility as a national statistical office or as a government to decide on that question. And that, of course, is not ideal, but that's just the fact. Now, of course, now EGRIS has been endorsed by the Stats Commission, and EGRIS makes some very clear recommendations on this and makes some very clear suggestions on that. And it being something that has been endorsed by the Stats Commission, I think that would be the first point, or the first reference to point people to, and say this is what the international community of statisticians and the international statistical community have decided and have endorsed, and that includes your country, dear NSO. So in that sense, I think that's that would be the first place to point people. But that's the sort of the norms-based answer. If we look in practice, of course, if we're looking at a country where, of course, displacement is a highly politically sensitive topic that an NSO has absolutely zero interest to get engaged in, or even there is also the flip side of that. If it's a country where we as supporters of international survey work have concerns that there might be sort of protection risks and implications from encouraging government to run this very detailed survey of refugees and IDPs, and we might not actually want to encourage that, then I don't think there is all that much that can happen. As always with national survey programs, it all depends on sort of finding consensus and finding what is acceptable to all parts of the undertaking. And I think if a government is completely against collecting that data, there's not all that much we can say, even if we're singing off the perfect song sheet, unfortunately. But that's just the reality.
Thanks, Felix. The last question that I see in the chat box is from Eric from Dakar. And Eric is asking about a methodology, actually, that we have been using in Mix, which you and I discussed at several points, which is about using the listing process to screen for households with IDPs and refugees. We do it for households under 5 children, but can it be applicable to screening for IDPs and refugees, and therefore be able to oversample households with IDPs and refugees? Is that a possibility, is the question?
From a methodological point of view, absolutely yes. And I think especially when it comes to IDPs, where we have much less detailed information on where they are. With refugees, we often have registration databases, right? So we have a rough idea of where people are. But with IDPs, we often do not. So when it comes to IDPs, then absolutely that would be a method of choice. But it depends very much on the density of the IDPs. If your density of IDPs in the areas that you're sampling from is so low that you may end up with 1 or 2 households in an entire EA, then even if you introduce a screener question in your listing form, you might still not reach your target sample size that you're wanting to get to for the IDPs from the sample EAs that you draw in the first place. But that we can simulate, that we can sort of get a proxy idea on in the first place. And if there is a sufficient density of IDPs in the area, then I think it's an absolutely fantastic option to go for, and it obviously enhances it increases your likelihood of reaching your target sample of IDPs by a factor of if we're saying average EA size 200, your selection of 15 to 20 or so, I mean, it just increases your likelihood of reaching that target, that IDP target, by a factor of 10, right? So I think it's definitely a valid methodological choice.
Yeah, maybe on that one, since the question also had a reference for a practice that we have in Mix, which is to oversample households with under 5s. Maybe I can also add the following, that when we do this kind of screening to be able to oversample a certain type of household, let's say, then we actually come up with some side products of this too. For instance, when we oversample households with under fives, then we inadvertently also oversample a certain age group of women who happen to be the mothers of those kids, which also means that we are undersampling, relatively speaking, some other age groups in the population. So in a survey, when we are doing this, approaching this from the perspective of IDPs and refugees, we would have to think about, if we're oversampling those households, what are we actually undersampling at the same time? For a multi-topic survey, of course, this would be an interesting question to look at, and it would have to depend on the nature of the IDPs and refugees and those households. So the interesting methodological question, I would think. So Bo has one more comment. Tricky to collect IDP info in listing. It may be too sensitive to have as your single reason to knock on the door. Within the household interviews, once you establish rapport, much better.
It's a valid point. And I think in some countries that does apply, in others, not so much. I think it really depends on the context. And it's just this sort of introducing a screener in the listing form. It's just one of the options in our toolkit, right? It's just one of our options in our menu. There's other ways, right? We might be able to have proxy information from the last census, even if there was a recent census. And we know from the census interviews, we have a proxy for displacement. We know the enumeration areas where there is a high density, down to the EA level, where there is a high density of IDPs. Or if we're talking about refugees, we might have citizenship in the census. So we might have a proxy for refugee status. And we might actually, down to the EA level, be able to identify those EAs with a high density or a high likely density of forcibly displaced people. And we can count those as one stratum, and we oversample from that. So we won't necessarily know at the listing stage, but we will have a very high likelihood that once we get to the interview stage and we from the completely random selection within those high density EAs, we would still expect to have a sufficiently large sample that we want to target. So true, it might not work in all countries, the screening at the listing stage, but in some it does, and in countries where it doesn't, we have other options.
Thanks, Felix. That's good. So far we have spoken, and in this webinar context, we have spoken about identifying IDPs and refugees, their inclusion in national surveys. But I would think that once they are included, there might be more interest from the community to collect more information specifically about the process with which these people have become refugees or IDPs, or other specific information about these populations. Does EGRIS or the JDC or others have any specific work coming up on such questions to be included together with the identification questions in household surveys?
Yes, indeed, that's the case. So as you rightly point out, including refugees and IDPs is, of course, not the only way, not the only valid way to collect survey data on refugees and IDPs. There is, of course, this whole field of standalone surveys and specialized surveys for refugees and IDPs. And that, in a way, that we've been doing for a long time, right? Not necessarily through national statistical offices, but if you look at what's been happening on refugee and IDP survey work over the past 20 years, you'll see a lot of standalone specialized surveys run by international agencies. You'll also find the occasional specialized standalone survey on refugees and IDPs done by national statistical offices. There's definitely more examples of that than we have examples of inclusion in the regular routine national surveys like the MIX and the DHS and the Labor Force Survey and so on. So we have many cases of that actually, and it still remains a valid tool to collect information. It's sort of the reason why we're so focused on national survey inclusion right now is because we feel that's where the greatest gap is. That's where not much has happened in the past, and that's something that needs to be remedied. But that's not to say that standalone surveys of refugees and IDPs are not a valid thing to do. I think it very much is, and oftentimes will be necessary, with a view to, as you rightly point out, collecting additional information that may not be captured, but also perhaps with a view to granularity and disaggregation, because when we're talking about a booster sample to the mix, for example, we're never going to be boosting 5,000 households, right? We're going to get one top level national estimate for all the refugees, or perhaps, you know, all the refugees in North and all the refugees in the South, two disaggregations. But, you know, we might need data down to the level of a specific camp or down to the level of 5 countries of origin. And we're never going to be able to add that sample size booster to a mix, simply because it puts too much weight on the routine surveys. So for all those different purposes, you might still want to run a standalone survey and a specialized survey. Now, to answer your specific question on, once we do that, once we decide to run a specific survey, what do we collect data on? I think there is one, the sort of the most rigid answer to that is in the EGRIS recommendations. There is a chapter 5 in both the refugee and the IDP recommendations that says these are the key areas of and sort of thematic indicator areas of concern when it comes to refugees and IDPs. A lot of them are stuff you also find and covered in the mix and the DHS and the National Living Conditions Survey, but some of them are not. So that's the sort of the most sort of explicit written down answer. But frankly speaking, when it comes to that degree of specialization and customization, if you're going through the hassle of setting up an entirely standalone specialized survey, most likely it's going to be very contextualized, right? Because you want to then make it completely focused on the forced displacement situation in a given country. And that might be, you know, in one country it might be social cohesion, in another place it might be psychosocial well-being, in other countries it might be repeat displacement movements. So again, I don't think there is as much a clear answer as there is for the national survey inclusion discussion when it comes to questionnaires.
Thanks, Felix. I don't see any other questions in the chat box, and I've already asked a couple of questions that were in my mind. So
probably we've spoken about sampling so much that half of the people have dozed off already.
Bo is saying, actually, to end with, do you have a hotline at JDC, or does contact go through UNHCR and World Bank?
It can go either way. You can contact us at the JDC directly. We're very interested to hear from you. There's 2 focals in JDC at the moment for the whole national survey inclusion discussion. You're looking at one hotline right now, and the other hotline is my colleague Donatien Begui. And either of us are very happy to hear about national survey inclusion opportunities on the horizon. But if you're working in a country office and you have a counterpart in UNHCR or in the World Bank, and you already have a rapport established, and you think that this could be something where, let's say, the UNHCR country office would be really interested to get engaged, but they don't necessarily have the funding or the technical capacity to engage with you on a discussion about a booster sample to the mix, for example, then you can also just reach out to your counterparts in the country office from UNHCR and encourage them to get in touch with us and point them in our direction, because, you know, we've been around for only 3.5 years, which is not a huge amount of time in an international organization. So they might not even know about the opportunities that we have. So both is a possibility, but in any case, here's your most direct hotline.
Great. The hotline did a really great job for this presentation today. Thank you so much, Felix. And from my person, as well as the UNICEF community and those of us who have been on this call, as was announced before, this is going to be on the Mix YouTube channel, as well as the UNICEF SharePoint site. So I'm sure there's going to be many, many more colleagues who will be interested to watch this recording, and we will continue to promote both this recording and the topic in general in the Mix workshops, and hopefully we are going to continue collaboration and discussions on this. So at this point, thank you very much again, and I hand over to Archana to wrap up.
Yes, thank you, Felix, very much for your excellent presentation and for all the comments and questions from the participants. So I'd like to remind you, as Attila said, that it's going to be on the Mix YouTube channel as well as the UNICEF SharePoint site. And also a reminder that our next and last webinar before we take a break for a few months will be next week. So we're doing it next Wednesday, June 14th, and it will be on the validation of mix plus substitution methodology. And Tatiana Karolak will be the one that will be presenting. So I hope you join us for that last presentation. And we'll see you shortly. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.